And so we thought it'd be helpful to sort of peel back the onion a little bit on the history of the city. And so this particular building was built in 1804. It is one of America's most historic buildings. We wanted to make sure that we sort of folded in storytelling. We talked a lot today about stories and how stories are incredibly important. And so Professor Damon Fordham is with us, and he's from Spartanburg, South Carolina, which is just outside of Charleston. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, raised in Mount Pleasant, just outside of Charleston. One of the things that you probably know already is that lawyers are very quick to correct you, which is something that I really love, that they guide their energy to sort of keep me on my toes. Professor Fordham is a treasure hunter. He's a storyteller, and he really likes to dig up a variety of untold stories here in Charleston. He is an adjunct history professor at the Citadel and the Charleston Southern University. He's authored 4 books, and his most recent book about the history of race relations in South Carolina, which was just published in July of 2022. He conducts a walking tour downtown called The Lost Stories of Black Charleston, and so we thought that he would sort of tie in so many things that are important to the firm, and we're really glad you're here. Thank you, Professor.
Okay. You're very welcome. And as the gentleman mentioned in his introduction, I kind of collect stories like other people collect stamps. My most recent book is called The 1895 Segregation Fight in South Carolina. Very little of what you're going to hear about today, but primarily what you're going to hear about is the kind of thing that I often do on my tour, which is an abridged version of the lost stories of Black Charleston. So here goes. You see, the beginnings of all of this are in 1526, when the Spanish king, Ferdinand, sent an explorer named Juan Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon to what we now call Georgetown, South Carolina, 50 miles to the north of us. And he brought a boatload of Africans as well as Spaniards with him. And so he founded, in what we now call Georgetown, the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe. But the colony of San Miguel Guadalupe did not last, because you see, he died early in the voyage, and he was replaced by an incompetent administrator. So the Africans rose up and killed him. So not only was that the first known slave rebellion in this area, and what would later become the United States, it was the first one that was successful. So the Africans then went into the wilderness where they blended in with the Native American population, and the black people of today's Georgetown, South Carolina are believed to be descended from these individuals. So the surviving Spaniards went back to Spain, where they wrote a report with King Ferdinand, which can today be read in a book called Yes, Lord, I Know the Road by J. Brent Morris. So 143 years later, King Charles II of England colonized this area, and being the humble, modest, and unassuming guy that he was, he named this place Charlestown. Not hard to figure out, right? So the next year, Captain Nathaniel sailed from England on a ship called the Three Brothers with some English settlers. And on the way, they stopped in Barbados, where they brought 3 Africans, who they gave the English names of John, John Jr., and Elizabeth. Needless to say, we don't know their English, their African names. So they landed here in April of 1670. And so this is the point where the history of Charleston and its relationship with black people began. Now, around the corner from us is a building of very little known historical significance. You had on 91 Broad Street, during the Reconstruction era, which I'm going to talk about in detail momentarily, the first black law firm in America, 91 Broad Street, that black building you see there. There was a black man from Indiana named Macon B. Allen, who came down here in 1868, 3 years after the fall of the Confederacy and after the fall of slavery. And he started that law office with two black Charlestonians, Robert Brown Elliott and William J. Whipper. Robert Brown Elliott made history in 1871, where against the fears and wishes of his wife, he testified against the brutality of the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina. And that testimony was so strong that it caused President Ulysses S. Grant to sign the Enforcement Act of 1871, which made domestic terrorism a felony offense in these United States. So every act of domestic terrorism that has gone before the courts since then, be it the Ku Klux Klan, be it the people who bombed and burned ROTC buildings during the Vietnam War era, up to the events of last January the 6th, all of these have been prosecuted under the Enforcement Act of 1871, and we owe all that to Robert Brown Elliott, who practiced law in that building until Reconstruction fell in 1877, and he went to New Orleans, where he died of tuberculosis in 1884 at the age of 42. But get this, in February of 2020, I had the honor and privilege of giving a tour to Robert Brown Elliott's great-great-granddaughter in that building. And that's one of many reasons why I love what I do. So around the corner from that is the federal courthouse. That was originally the city's armory, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in the 1940s and 50s, that court was run by a man who was largely forgotten by the history books, but who I think is very important, whose name was Judge Julius Waties Waring. Judge Waring was born here in 1880. His father was a Confederate general. And his term on the court was relatively uneventful until 1946. He tried a case called Isaac Woodard versus Linwood Shaw. And here was what happened. Isaac Woodard was a black veteran of World War II, who was in 1946, he was in a bus station in Augusta, Georgia, waiting to catch a bus to go back to see his wife after he had been discharged. And on the way going back to Winnsboro, while he's in the back of the bus in rural South Carolina, he asked the bus driver if he could pull over to use the bathroom. Well, the bus driver called him the N-word and told him that you get off of this blankety-blank bus when I stop this so-and-so bus. Well, Isaac Woodard had just gotten back from fighting the Japanese, and he was feeling no fear. So in the back of the bus, in rural South Carolina, in 1946, he cursed the bus driver back. This didn't end well. The bus driver then went into the country town of Batesburg, South Carolina, which is 40 miles to the west of Columbia. And the bus driver went into the jail and got Sheriff Linwood Shaw, who proceeded to drag Isaac Woodard off of the bus and beat him in the face with a billy club until he lost his sight. Judge Waring tried that case. And he told the all-white jury to deliberate. And within 5 minutes, the jury came back in favor of Sheriff Shaw, said, "Not guilty, Your Honor." And the courthouse erupted into a yee-haw. Well, Judge Waring's wife, Elizabeth, ran out of the courthouse in tears. And Judge Waring took off his robe, stormed into the street, and vowed he would never try another case like this again as long as he lived. So 1 year later, July 12, 1947, in that courthouse, right across the street from where we're standing right now on Meeting Street, Judge Julius Waties Waring ruled that the laws preventing black people from voting in South Carolina since the end of Reconstruction violated the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and was thus null and void. That led the way to black people voting in South Carolina again. So he was a hero to my parents' generation of black people. But he was a villain to many of the mass of more conservative white people in this area. So he had rocks thrown through his window and crosses burned on his lawn. And in 1948, he went to pay a courtesy call to President Harry S. Truman. And he told President Truman the story that I just told you. And President Truman said, "My God, I had no idea it was that bad down there." And that is what led President Truman to sign the executive order desegregating the armed forces of these United States. 3 years later, Judge Waring tried a case called Briggs versus Elliott. Harry Briggs and his wife Eliza, a courageous black couple up in Summerton, South Carolina, sued because the black school was basically a shack while the white school was palatial. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to understand that one of the main reasons for that situation was that the wealthy elite of the South wanted the blacks to serve as a permanent class of cheap labor. And what better way to do that than to separate, isolate, and, for lack of a better word, undereducate a population of people for that purpose? So they sued. And their lawyer was the great Thurgood Marshall, who I'm sure that most of you know was the first African-American Supreme Court justice later on in 1967. And Judge Waring ruled that the laws, that the segregation violated the 14th Amendment to the Constitutional Equal Protection Clause of the United States. But that was a federal case, and he was outvoted by the two other white federal judges, John J. Parker and George Bell Timmerman, the latter who became our governor not too long after this, to prevent the segregation from happening in South Carolina. Well, he faced another round of harassment, and he said, man, this is too much. I'm too old for this, 72. So he went to New York. But during the time of his exile, that case made its way to the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. as Brown versus the Board of Education, the case that paved the way for the eventual desegregation of the schools. So Judge Waring died in New York in 1968 at the age of 88. And they sent his body down here for the funeral. And at his funeral, on a rainy day, were a total of 6 whites and over 300 blacks. So in 2014, our senior senator, Ernest Fritz Hollins, along with President Barack Obama, declared that the courthouse, the federal building in the courthouse across the street from where we're standing right now, would be renamed the Judge Julius Waties Waring Judicial Center. And Eric Holder, the first black attorney general in the United States, came down here to unveil the new name of the building, a statue of Judge Waring, and the marker, which is right next to the building. And the crowd of thousands of Charlestonians came here to witness that event. And among them was yours truly. Now that building, or should I say the site of that building, also played another, across from where we're standing right now, played another very little known part, but it's a major part in American history that the average person does not know. And I'm about to tell it to you. And I'm going to tell you this. Even the average Charlestonian, the average South Carolinian, the average American does not know what I'm about to tell you next. My favorite period in American history is called the Reconstruction era. The reason why it is my favorite is because so little is known by the average person about it. And I love to talk about things that the average person doesn't know, so you don't hear the same stories over and over again. And it was the period between 1865 and 1877 when the federal government tried to reform the Confederacy through 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment in 1865 that ended slavery throughout the country. The 14th Amendment in 1868 that said that all persons born here were citizens. And the 15th Amendment in 1870 that said all men have the right to vote. Women would get that, as most of you know, with the 19th Amendment in 1920. But this period was largely excised from American history books and distorted for reasons I'm going to get into later. But those of us who are library rats and archive hounds are among the few that know what I'm about to tell you next. That period was one of the greatest periods of reform in the history of these United States and perhaps even the world. And I'll tell you why. Amazing things happened that have largely escaped the history books. For example, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in 1872, there was the first African-American governor. His name was Pinckney Benton Stewart Pinchback, and he was also the founder of Southern University down in Baton Rouge, the second largest black college in America behind North Carolina A&T up in Greensboro. There was also here in South Carolina from 1870 to 1872, two black lieutenant governors, Alonzo Jacob Ransier and Richard Howard Gleaves. Alonzo Jacob Ransier served from 1870 to 1872, and Richard Howard Gleaves served from 1872 to 1877. Richard Howard Gleaves, by the way, served as the lieutenant governor under Governor Franklin J. Moses, making this the first time in American history, perhaps in the world, that you had a municipality governed by a black lieutenant governor and a Jewish governor. South Carolina was the first. Think about that. So as all this was going on, right here in Charleston, in that building, across from where we are right now, you had a convention from January to April 1868 to totally change the Constitution of South Carolina and to make it one of the most progressive that this nation had ever seen up to that time. 76 blacks and 48 whites gathered across the street from where we are now, which was then known as the Charleston Clubhouse, and they drafted the Declaration of Rights, aka the South Carolina Constitutional Convention of 1868, which you can find on darkarchive.org today. And among other things, that Constitution declared that there would be anti-discrimination laws in our state constitution. Women would be allowed to divorce abusive husbands. There would be state hospitals and mental institutions. There would be a ban on debtors' prisons. And one of the most important things took place on January the 23rd, 1868. Robert Smalls, a great man who is now beginning to get historical recognition. In 1862, he sneaked himself and the rest of the slave family on a Confederate ship called the Planter in Charleston Harbor and off into freedom. Well, in 1868, he got up in that building and declared, resolved, all children between the ages of 7 and 14 in South Carolina must attend public school at least 6 months a year under penalty of noncompliance. Ladies and gentlemen, that was the first public school law ever passed this far south, below the Mason-Dixon line, by an ex-slave, free man, Civil War hero, by the name of Mr. Robert Smalls. And if you don't believe me, you can go to the South Carolina room of the Charleston County Library, look up the minutes of the 1868 Constitutional Convention for January the 23rd, 1868, and there it is. Now, often when I talk about these things, people have two questions. Question number one, why haven't I heard any of this before? And question number two, well, what the heck happened? Ladies and gentlemen, I'll explain them both. Throughout the history of the Deep South, the wealthy class of whites feared that the poor whites, in their squalor and illiteracy and destitute condition, would find common cause with their black brethren, and that these two groups would come together in their suffering and form a social and cultural and economic revolution that would overthrow the rule of the wealthy white class of the South. And this, of course, they could not deal with. So, what they did was they gave the poor whites more privileges than their black brethren and encouraged them to separate themselves from and hate and fear their African-American brethren. In simple terms, ladies and gentlemen, divide and conquer of the poor so that the rich could stay rich. That's what racism is all about, Charlie Brown. So, December 24th, 1865, Pulaski, Tennessee. 6 Confederate veterans gathered at the courthouse in Pulaski to form the Resistance Army against Reconstruction. They named themselves after the Greek word for circle, which is kuklos, and the Scottish word for family, which is clan. See where that led? That's how the Ku Klux Klan started. And this led to 12 years of anarchy and bloodshed in the Deep South. Memphis Massacre of 1866, New Orleans Massacre of 1866, Meridian, Mississippi Massacre of 1871, Colfax, Louisiana Massacre of 1874, Clinton, Mississippi Massacre of 1875, Hamburg, South Carolina Massacre of 1876, and exactly 146 years ago, almost to this date, November the 8th, 1876, blacks and whites shot it out in the middle of the street right behind us on Broad Street, according to the Charleston News and Courier newspaper of that next day. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, you had a hot mess. And the federal government said, whoa, this is too much. We can't handle this. We got to put a stop to this mess. This isn't working. So they passed the Tilden-Hayes Compromise of 1877 that put an end to Reconstruction in the South. And the former Confederates went, yeehaw! And the black residents fell into deep despair. But as you'll see in a couple of minutes, that didn't exactly stop. So in 1895, the nail went on the coffin, but not without resistance. South Carolina followed the lead of Mississippi in 1890, who in Jackson, Mississippi, under Governor James K. Fordham, had a constitutional convention where they threw out their progressive constitution and replaced it with the pro-segregation constitution. So Benjamin Tilden, then Senator of South Carolina, arranged for this to happen at the State House in Columbia. But in a story that I described in my most recent book, 6 brave black leaders made the journey. Robert Smalls, who we discussed earlier, Thomas Miller, founder of our black university, South Carolina State, William J. Whipper, the black lawyer who was on Broad Street, James Wigg and Isaiah Reed, 2 black lawyers from Beaufort, and Robert Anderson, a black teacher from Georgetown. These men made the trek to Columbia, and in the face of great threats and insults, boldly stood up to do what they could to put a stop to this. And in the end, they lost 116-7. But in that, and incidentally, among the ones who sided with these black gentlemen were 2 white representatives. There was T.E. Dudley out of Marlborough County and John Harleston Reed out of Georgetown, the 2 white representatives that stood with the blacks. But even within that defeat laid the foundation for the civil rights movement in South Carolina that was to come to undo all of these things. Now, I think that this is important for the young people of today to understand, which is why I've written about these in my books and I talk about them a lot. Because right now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think I'm going to get in an argument with any of you, regardless of your political beliefs, when I tell you that in this country, we are in a state of confusion. And there's a great lack of direction. A lot of people want to end the problems of the day, but they don't know what to do. Okay? So they often settle with symbolic things. And they get on these crusades to change semantics, as if that does anything for the poorest and least of us in our society, other than making educated people feel like they've done something and give them a pat on the back. Now, back in China, in the about 2,000 years ago, a wise man, when his country was going through a violent period called the Warring States period, he studied the teachings of the wise elders of China, and he went throughout the countryside trying to teach them to the rulers of China, but they didn't want to hear that stuff, and he died feeling he was a failure. But as he was teaching, the young people there listened, and they compiled his teachings in a book. You might have heard of him. Over there, his name was pronounced Confucius. Over here, we call it Confucius. And that was the man whose teachings rescued China from barbarism. And this is one of the reasons why I study this stuff, because I feel that Dr. King, in one of his earliest sermons in 1954, did a sermon called Rediscovering Lost Values, and said that if we look back at some of the wise teachings of before, we could find some treasures that were left behind that could help us today. And that's one reason why I do what I do. Now, moving right along. While you're in this area, I know you noticed that the Charleston culture is a little bit different than a lot of other places. We have our own culture here, particularly among the African Americans, who you've probably seen the ladies weaving their baskets, and you notice that the African Americans here speak a little bit differently than other places. This is what is known as the Gullah culture, sometimes synonymously called Geechee. And it gets its name from the fact that in Sierra Leone and Liberia, West Africa, you have what's called the Boya tribe. And these people, among several others, were those who specialized in growing rice and making these sweetgrass baskets to stir and sift the rice. Well, these were a large population of the black people who were taken over here to the Charleston area, to the area between Georgetown, South Carolina to the north, and Brunswick, Georgia to the south, to the Sea Islands to work on the plantations. Those Sea Islands were so isolated that the black people there kept more of their African speech, folkways, and culture than any other black people brought to America, and that became what's known as the Gullah culture. My grandmother, Janie Fordham, was born around 1900, all in North South Carolina. And because she had to work in the fields as a little girl, she never learned to read and write. So she spoke Gullah till the day she died. In 1968, when I was 4 years old, my grandmother used to call me in the house by going, "Damon, y'all turn too trifling. Y'all better come on and yup white box y'all," and things like that. And she and my grandfather saved their money so that my dad could go to South Carolina State in Orangeburg, South Carolina's black college. And Dad was the first of 3 generations of teachers in our family. I am the second and my nephew's the third. Now, back in those days, it's a little rough on the third. Back in those days, if you were black and in a middle-class, educated family here in Charleston, your parents didn't want you speaking Gullah, because back then it was looked down upon as countrified and ignorant and backward. But as you could tell, I always had a love for mimicry. And every now and then I deliberately make Dad furious by going, "Daddy, I'm hungry, I want some local soup." He goes, "Stop it, I didn't send you to school to talk like that." "Oh, what's wrong, Daddy? I just want to eat. Stop it! Quit looking at grandmother. Stop, I said." So in 1932, there was Dr. Lorenzo Dow Turner, who was a black linguist at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And he came to teach at South Carolina State. And he was shocked to hear the students from the Charleston area say things like, "Man, Dr. Turner, you what up in there, man, up the window." Excuse me? "Man, Dr. Turner, what up in ya, up the window? Why, what type of speech is this? I find this fascinating. This I must study." So he went throughout coastal South Carolina and Georgia studying Gullah. And in 1949, he wrote Africanisms in the Gullah dialect. So in 1988, General Joseph Momo of Sierra Leone spoke at the Penn Center, which is 70 miles south of here in St. Helens Island. And he got up in front of the people and said in his native tongue, "I'm glad you passed here today. I'm glad to see you today." And a lady in the audience who spoke Gullah replied, "Red boy, that man for talk like we. He sounds like us." So the man who was glad he passed the people that talk like we back to Sierra Leone. And the people on both sides were amazed at the similarities of languages, lifestyles, and culture, that PBS went along with them and filmed a documentary that was fittingly entitled Family Across the Sea. And that's the story of Gullah. Now, not very far from us is a place called the Old Slave Market Museum. And here's the story behind that. To back up a little bit, in 1502, Christopher Columbus was on his 3rd voyage to the Western Hemisphere. And he brought along with him a Spanish priest named Padre Bartolomé de Casas. And Father Bartolomé was horrified by Columbus's enslavement of the Native Americans of that region. So he came up with a solution: go to Africa and use the blacks instead. Now, over the summer, I was in Senegal and Gambia, West Africa. And one of the islands off the coast of Senegal is Gorée Island, which in the midst of this process, the Portuguese had taken, and Goree Island is literally on the furthest western point of the Horn of West Africa, which makes it the closest point to the Western Hemisphere. So that was the island that was used as the slave port, as one of the several slave ports. Now, when I went there, they have what's called the door of no return, where they had pens and cages where they kept the Africans they captured and would march them on the plank to the slave ships from this door of no return. I went there and I literally collapsed in the arms of one of the ladies who I went there with. It's a very heavy emotional experience. And on one of the places on the other side of that was on the corner of Broad and East Bay Street with the old Exchange Building. Next to that, a few blocks from us, is a platform where they had the slave sales, which is today, there's a marker by it. That was there from 1771 to 1856. Why 1856? Here's what happened. By 1856, the people of Charleston were sick and tired of walking down the street and seeing them up there naked and in chains and being sold and families being separated and all these horrible, disgusting sights. So the mayor realized that the people didn't want to see this, but it was making money for the city. Meanwhile, there was an alderman named Thomas Ryan who owned Ryan's Market over on number 6 Chalmers Street. So since the mayor didn't want the people of Charleston to see these goings-on, he arranged for Thomas Ryan to, at Ryan's Market, they would ban the slave sales on the outside, but Thomas Ryan would sell them on the inside. That way, the people of Charleston wouldn't have to see these goings-on, but they would still make money off of slavery in Charleston. Oh, the humanity. But how do we know what this experience was like? Well, one of my heroes was a man by the name of Elijah Green, who in the early 1900s would sit in front of the old slave market and tell anyone who cared to listen to his stories about slavery in Charleston and his experience as such. He talked about Harry and Janie Black, who in 1850 were hanged over on a tree in Ashley Avenue for trying to poison their slave owners. He would talk about how his own slave master was such a coward that after Fort Sumter, when they came looking for young Confederate volunteers, the slave owner ran in the attic and told Elijah to tell them they weren't home. He talked about how Thomas Ryan was so quick to use the whip at that slave market, among other things. In 1937, a black writer named Augustus Ladson went there and wrote down his stories for the Slave Narratives Project. And today you can find his stories in a book called Before Freedom, When I Just Can Remember by Belinda Hermans, and my own book, True Stories of Black South Carolina. And in January 5th, 1940, Elijah Green was interviewed with his stories for the Charleston News and Courier and was somewhat of a local celebrity. And in 1942, at the age of 100, the Black Women's YWCA, which until recently was over on Cumming Street, invited him to get up there in his centennial year before an audience and tell his stories the way that I'm telling you these stories right now. And this was 3 years before he died at the age of 103 in 1942. And I say Elijah Green is one of my heroes because, in a sense, he's somewhat of a role model of what I do now, in that he used his experiences and truths to tell these stories which increased understanding of that situation and which could hopefully lead to improvements in this situation. And myself, I do what I do through research and experience to tell you these things, these kind of stories for that same purpose, including Life Grand Finale for this evening, which is a story that was largely buried in South Carolina's history up until very recent times, that of the Denmark-Vesey Slave Rebellion of 1822. Denmark-Vesey was born in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, around 1767. And he was owned by a Charlestonian named Captain Joseph Vesey. Captain Vesey needed somebody to do the paperwork for the plantation, so he taught Denmark how to read. Boy, did he live to regret that. Denmark read other things, see. He read Exodus 21:16, which said, "He that stealeth a man and selleth him shall be put to death." And Revelation 13:10 that said, "He that leadeth into captivity shall be led into captivity." Stuff you don't hear in church. Gee, I wonder why. And he also read about the Haitian Revolution, where the blacks of Haiti, under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, overthrew the rule of Napoleon to make Haiti the first free black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Things you don't usually hear about outside of an upper-level college classroom. Gee, I wonder why. Well, with all this, you can guess what was on his mind. They came here in 1782, and Captain Vesey would rent Denmark out to other slave owners to do chores for them, in which Captain Vesey would collect a commission and split it with Denmark. So Denmark was walking down East Bay Street on September 30th, 1799, when he saw a barker with a roulette wheel and a crowd surrounding him. And the barker said, "Hurry, hurry, hurry, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, step right on, place your bets on the number, step right up. Round and round she goes. Where she stops, nobody knows." And Denmark placed a bet on number 1884 and won $1,500. So he went back to Captain Vesey. Let's see now. I'm here working in my ledger. "Oh, Denmark, come on in. What can I do for you, old boy?" "Captain Vesey, I have a question for you." "Why, certainly. What is it?" "Sir, how much am I worth?" "How much are you worth? Well, let me look in my ledger here. Let's see. Yes. According to this, you're worth $600. Why do you ask?" Look at him. 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 "Okay, I'm worth 600. Bam! Here is 8. See ya. Hey, wait a minute, Denmark. Have a nice day." So Captain Vesey took Denmark to the courthouse. And on December 31st, 1799, Denmark Vesey became thenceforward and forever free. So he became a carpenter as well as a lay minister at the Hempstead A&E Church on Charleston's east side. And while he was doing that, he was secretly gathering his followers to plan the Great Slave Rebellion of 1822. The plan was, they were going to break into the city's armory, which is right across the street from where we are, where the federal building is today, and steal guns. Then they were going to go throughout Charleston setting fires. And when the slave owners came to put them out, pow, 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 pow. Then they would go throughout Charleston, freeing black people. And they would lead them down to Charleston Harbor, where they'd take the guns and hijack ships and sail to Haiti, where they would be free. However, May 25th, 1822, 200 years ago, one of Denmark Vesey's followers, William Paul, went down to the corner of Broad East Bay Street, and he ran into Peter Craylor, who was owned by Captain John Craylor. He said, "Hey, Peter, what's going on? How you doing there, Mr. Paul?" "Oh, I'm all right." "Hey, Peter, you want to get down what Denmark Vesey's trying to do?" "Denmark Vesey? Who's that?" "Shh. Not so loud. Here's my plan, Peter. We're going to..." "Whoa, wait a minute now. You going to do that?" "Peter, wait a minute. Pete, don't. Hey, now. Hey, Peter, wait." Peter ran back to his owner, Captain John Craylor. "Mr. Craylor, Mr. Craylor, Mr. Craylor." "Oh, my goodness, Peter. What do you mean by waking me up at this ungodly hour? What's the matter with you? You're shaking like a leaf on a tree." "Mr. Craylor, guess what Mr. Denmark Vesey's going to do? Guess what he's going to do?" "He is? Oh, my goodness. Heavens to Murgatroyd. This is outrageous. Atrocious. And it's pretty bad, too. I must call out the militia expeditiously and right now." So he called out the militia. And Vesey and 34 of his followers were arrested on June the 16th, 1822. And on July the 2nd, 1822, Denmark Vesey and his followers were hanged by the neck until then. Peter was fat and happy. The state of South Carolina freed Peter and gave him a financial stipend for the rest of his life. The city of Charleston built a fort on Marion Square that was designed to put down slave rebellions in the future. And in 1842, that fort became a school And in 1922, that school moved to its present location. You might have heard of it, the Citadel Military College. That's how it started. And very recently, I had a talk with the students about that. Very few of them knew. Read into that what you will. However, not too far from us on Trash Street, there was a free and educated black man at that time named Bishop Daniel Alexander Payne. And he owned a school for free and enslaved children. But because Denmark Vesey used the Bible and history books and the Constitution to encourage revolution, the state of South Carolina made it illegal to teach an African American to read and write. So they shut down his school. But he didn't let that stop him. He went to Xenia, Ohio, where he started Wilberforce College, the first black college in America that was run by black people. And one of his students was Bishop Richard Harvey King. Bishop King came down here in 1865 and took what was left of the Hempstead AME Church and built a new church on 110 Calhoun Street. He named the church after the Hebrew word for God is with us and said it would be the mother of the new black churches in Charleston. And we know that church today as Mother Emanuel AME Church. June 17, 2015, the terrorist Dylan Roof entered Mother Emanuel and assassinated my good friend, the Reverend Clemente Pinckney, and the librarian Cynthia Hurd, and 7 other members of the congregation. Dylan Roof was tried right across the street from us at the Julius Waites Waring Judicial Center. And today, he is at the federal courthouse, his federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, awaiting his execution. 2 days after the assassinations at Mother Emanuel, 10,000 of us marched on the church, myself included, and showed the world that we were not afraid to go back. So as we were outside chanting and clapping our hands and singing our songs, the Jewish community of Charleston marched in front of the church, formed a circle, and recited the Hebrew prayer of the dead to show solidarity with us. 3 years later, the Tree of Life Synagogue met the same fate in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So many of us went to the Conservative Synagogue in West Ashland to fellowship with our Jewish brethren, to return that favor of solidarity. And with that being said, my name is Damon Fordham, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.